Being a goldfish might be the smartest psychological decision you ever make. And science is only now explaining exactly why. Most people spend years, sometimes decades, carrying the weight of experiences that are finished, people who are gone, and versions of themselves that no longer exist. What if the brain's ability to hold on is not a strength, but a measurable liability? And what if the people who have learned to release without forgetting are not weaker, but neurologically freer than everyone around them? This is not about suppressing your feelings or pretending bad things didn't happen. The research shows that the real goldfish move is something far more sophisticated. And the gap between people who can do it and people who can't shows up in health outcomes, relationship quality, professional performance, and the specific quality of daily experience. And the mechanism behind it starts with something almost no one has been taught clearly. By the end of this video, you will understand the precise neuroscience of why human beings hold on. Why the brain is literally built to make letting go difficult. You will understand what the people who genuinely release difficult experiences are doing at the level of their nervous system. You will have 5 specific evidence-based techniques that are grounded in real research. And you will walk away with a completely different understanding of what it means to be a goldfish. Because the goal is not to forget. The goal is something much more powerful. Let's begin by dismantling the premise. Because the goldfish itself has been misrepresented for decades, and that misrepresentation matters. The idea that goldfish have a 3-second memory is one of the most repeated and most thoroughly false facts in popular culture. It has appeared in films, in advertising, in motivational speeches, and in conversations so often that it has the feel of scientific consensus. It is not. Research by Dr. Cullum Brown at Macquarie University in Australia established that goldfish demonstrate reliable spatial memory, conditioned learning, and the ability to retain information across time spans measured in months, not seconds. Studies at the Fisheries and Marine Institute at Memorial University of Newfoundland trained goldfish to navigate mazes and return to specific locations, demonstrating that their memory architecture is genuinely functional and persistent. The 3-second myth has no credible scientific origin and has been contradicted by multiple independent research programs. So why does the myth persist? And more importantly, why does the metaphor still resonate even after the factual error is corrected? Because the thing the myth describes, the capacity for genuine present tense living, unencumbered by the accumulated weight of negative past experience, is a real and documented psychological capacity. One that human beings, unlike goldfish, cannot access by default. One that requires deliberate, specific cognitive and emotional work to develop, and one that the research has now mapped in enough detail to be genuinely teachable. The goldfish metaphor, properly understood, is not about a faulty memory. It is about a specific relationship with time and experience, the capacity to fully process what has happened, and then move through it rather than carrying it forward as an active, ongoing source of distress. And that capacity, the research shows, is one of the most consequential psychological skills available to human beings. But to understand why it is difficult, you need to understand what the brain is actually doing when it holds on. And the story starts with a mechanism that was built for a world that no longer exists. The human brain is approximately 300 Bowditch years old in its current basic form. For the vast majority of that time, it operated in an environment where the primary threats to survival were physical, immediate, and lethal. Predators, hostile groups, environmental hazards, food scarcity, falls, infections. The entire motivational and attentional architecture of the brain was shaped by selection pressure in this environment. And in that environment, one of the most survival-relevant cognitive capacities was the precise, durable, emotionally vivid memory of threatening experiences. Research by James McGaw at the University of California, Irvine, established that emotionally significant experiences, particularly threatening ones, are encoded in memory with significantly greater strength, detail, and durability than emotionally neutral ones. The mechanism is hormonal. When the body perceives threat, it releases a cascade of stress hormones, primarily cortisol and norepinephrine, that directly modulate the hippocampus, the brain's memory consolidation center, in ways that cause the experience to be encoded more deeply, remembered more vividly, and retrieved more readily than ordinary events. This process has a name: memory consolidation enhancement, and it is one of the most reliably replicated findings in all of neuroscience. Think about what this means from an evolutionary perspective. The animal that survived a predator attack and encoded the specific sensory details, the sound, the location, the environmental conditions, the behavioral sequence that preceded the attack, with exceptional precision and durability, was the animal that recognized and avoided similar situations in the future. That animal survived and reproduced. The animal that processed the attack neutrally and moved on without particularly strong encoding was statistically more likely to encounter the same predator again under similar circumstances. That animal was selected against. You are the biological descendant of the animal that held on. Your brain carries, as one of its most fundamental operating principles, the instruction to encode threatening experiences deeply and keep them accessible. Not because your brain is damaged or dysfunctional, because this is what the system was built to do. The problem is that the system was not built for the world you are actually living in. The threats that activate this memory enhancement process in a modern human life are almost never physical, almost never lethal, and almost never ongoing in the way that would make continued vigilance adaptive, the argument with a colleague. The criticism from a superior, the social embarrassment, the relationship that ended badly, the failure at something that mattered, these experiences activate the same memory enhancement mechanism that evolved to encode the predator's approach. And the result is that the brain treats them with the same cognitive resources, the same vivid encoding, the same heightened accessibility, the same sustained emotional charge, that was appropriate for an ongoing physical threat. The experience that was over 3 years ago feels, when it surfaces, as if it just happened. The criticism that was addressed and moved past still produces a physiological stress response when recalled. The embarrassment that no one else remembers is remembered by your nervous system with extraordinary precision and preserved with extraordinary care. Your brain is not failing to let go because you are weak or undisciplined or emotionally immature. Your brain is failing to let go because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The design was optimized for a world that no longer exists, and that gap between the system the brain evolved to be and the world the brain is currently navigating is where most of what we mean by psychological suffering lives. But memory strength alone does not explain the full picture, because there is a second mechanism operating alongside the emotional memory enhancement that significantly compounds the problem. And understanding it changes how you think about what your mind is actually trying to accomplish when it keeps returning to difficult experiences. In 1927, a young Lithuanian psychology student named Bluma Zeigarnik made an observation at a cafe in Vienna that would become one of the most cited findings in all of memory research. She noticed that the waiters at the cafe had a remarkable memory for the current orders of their active tables, able to recall specific combinations of food and drink for multiple customers simultaneously, but that they forgot these details almost immediately once the bill was paid and the customers left. The memory for the active unresolved order was excellent. The memory for the completed resolved order evaporated. She brought this observation back to her supervisor, the influential Gestalt psychologist Kurt Lewin, who encouraged her to study it formally. Her experiments confirmed the observation at scale. Incomplete tasks, tasks that had been started but not finished, were recalled roughly twice as frequently as completed tasks given equal amounts of initial learning time. Zeigarnik's explanation: the mind maintains incomplete tasks in a state of elevated cognitive accessibility because the cognitive system has not yet received the signal that the task is done. The open loop stays open, and the brain keeps the relevant information activated and accessible in service of completing the task when the opportunity arises. This finding, now called the Zeigarnik Effect, has profound implications for understanding why the mind keeps returning to negative experiences. The experiences that the mind revisits most persistently are almost always experiences that contain an unresolved element, not the experiences that were fully processed, fully understood, and fully integrated. The experiences where something is still open, something that was said that was never responded to adequately, a decision that was made whose outcome is still uncertain, a relationship that ended without the kind of closure that would allow a coherent narrative to be formed about what it meant. An event that was survived but not understood, that happened but whose meaning has never been clearly grasped. The brain is returning to these experiences because it is looking for the resolution that would allow the open loop to be closed. The repetitive, intrusive quality of ruminative thought, the way difficult experiences keep surfacing, keep demanding attention, keep refusing to stay buried, is not a malfunction of the memory system. It is the memory system doing exactly what it is designed to do, keeping information relevant to an unresolved task available for continued processing. The critical implication: the experiences that will not release are not holding on because they are too painful to let go. They are holding on because they have not yet been completed. Because the specific cognitive and emotional processing that would deliver the resolution signal has not been done. And this distinction between experiences that are too painful versus experiences that are incompletely processed is the most important single insight in the entire psychology of psychological release. Because it changes the question from how do I stop feeling this to what does this experience still need from me? The answer to that question is what the Goldfish practice is actually built on. But before we get to the specific techniques, there is one more mechanism that the research has identified, one that is operating specifically in people who are most stuck, and it involves something about identity that most people have never examined directly. The brain does not only hold on to negative experiences because they represent survival-relevant threat information or unresolved cognitive tasks. There is a third mechanism, and in some ways it is the most powerful and most resistant to change of the three. Some experiences become incorporated into identity. They stop being things that happen to the person and become, at the level of psychological self-organization, part of who the person is. Research by Dan McAdams at Northwestern University on narrative identity, the psychological concept that humans understand themselves through the stories they tell about their own lives, established that autobiographical memory is not a neutral archive. It is a selective, interpretive, meaning-making process in which certain experiences are elevated into what McAdams calls nuclear episodes, defining moments that anchor the personal narrative and organize the understanding of who the person is, where they came from, and what their life means. When a negative experience becomes a nuclear episode, when the painful loss, the significant failure, the defining humiliation, the formative wound is incorporated into the identity-defining narrative, something psychologically important changes. The experience is no longer simply something that happened, it is something that explains who you are. And because identity is the organizing structure of the self, because it determines which new experiences are attended to, how they are interpreted, and what they are made to mean, the identity-incorporated negative experience functions in an entirely different way than an ordinary painful memory. Releasing an ordinary painful memory requires completing the processing. Releasing an identity-incorporated negative experience requires revising the narrative. And narrative revision is psychologically costly in a way that memory processing is not, because it creates a specific form of uncertainty, the uncertainty of not knowing who you are without the story that the held-onto experience supports. Research by Robin Fivush at Emory University on autobiographical memory and identity formation found that the experiences people remember most persistently and most vividly are not necessarily the most emotionally intense ones. They are the ones that are most self-defining. The experiences that are integrated into the narrative as explanations of how the person became who they are. This is why some people carry grievances for decades with no reduction in the emotional charge, why some people's entire understanding of themselves is organized around a wound from their past, a difficult childhood, a professional failure, a relationship that ended badly, a version of themselves they cannot stop identifying with. The holding on is not fundamentally about the event. It is about the narrative infrastructure that the event has been built into, and that infrastructure is resistant to revision, not because the person is weak or unwilling, but because revising it requires temporarily tolerating a genuinely threatening form of self-uncertainty. The person who has built their identity around being the one who was wronged, the one who failed, the one who was not enough, or the one who overcame, the one who survived, the one who was shaped by adversity, cannot simply release the organizing experience without simultaneously reorganizing the self-understanding that experience has been supporting. And this is precisely why the approach of simply deciding to let go, of willing yourself into release, fails so reliably for experiences in this category. The will is working at the level of behavior. The holding on is operating at the level of identity. And identity does not respond to willpower. It responds to something else entirely, something that the research has identified with enough precision to be genuinely applicable. But there is one more thing I need to tell you before we get to the practices. Because there is a mechanism that most people use, instinctively, automatically, as their first response to painful experience, that the research has established is precisely backwards. And if you are using it, it is actively extending the very suffering you are trying to end. Here is one of the most reliably documented and most widely ignored findings in all of cognitive psychology. When you try not to think about something, when you make a deliberate effort to suppress a thought, push an unwanted memory out of awareness, or avoid the internal experience of a difficult emotion, the thought does not go away. It comes back more frequently, more intrusively, and often with greater emotional intensity than if you had not attempted to suppress it at all. This is Daniel Wegner's ironic process theory, and it is one of the most replicated findings in experimental psychology. Wegner, a psychologist at Harvard University, demonstrated the phenomenon in a deceptively simple experiment that has since been reproduced in dozens of variations across multiple laboratories. He instructed research participants to think of anything they wished for 5 minutes, but to avoid thinking of a white bear. Participants rang a bell every time the white bear thought intruded, despite their effort to prevent it. The white bear thought intruded frequently. far more frequently than in a control group that was instructed to think about the white bear freely. This is the basic finding. Suppression attempts increase intrusive thought frequency. But the more significant finding came in the next phase of the experiment. When the suppression instruction was removed and participants were told they could now think of whatever they wished, those who had previously been suppressing the white bear thought showed a dramatic increase in white bear intrusions, significantly higher than the control group, as if the suppressed content was releasing under pressure, flooding back into awareness with the force of its prior compression. Wegener called this the rebound effect, and it has been replicated with emotionally significant content, suppressed memories, unwanted emotions, intrusive thoughts related to distressing experiences. With consistent results, suppression not only fails to reduce the frequency of unwanted mental content, it often increases it, and it produces a predictable rebound when the suppression effort relaxes. Research by James Gross at Stanford on emotional regulation strategies confirmed the physiological cost of suppression. Gross found that individuals who use suppression as their primary emotional regulation strategy attempting to prevent or minimize the internal experience of negative emotions showed significantly higher levels of cardiovascular reactivity, sympathetic nervous system activation, and cortisol release during emotionally challenging situations compared to individuals who used other regulation strategies. The body was carrying the work of the suppressed emotion, even when the mind was attempting to not have the experience. This means that the most intuitive and most commonly used response to painful emotional experience, the attempt to not think about it, push it away, move on by force of will, is, on the available evidence, actively counterproductive, not merely ineffective, counterproductive. It increases the accessibility of the suppressed content, increases the physiological stress response, and sets up the rebound effect that will flood the suppressed material back at the next moment of reduced vigilance. The Goldfish approach is not suppression, it is not forced positivity or deliberate not feeling. It is something qualitatively different from every instinctive response to pain that the human system tends to generate. And to understand what it actually is, we need to look at the mechanism at the center of the research, the one finding that changes everything about how to think about psychological release. Before we can name the solution, we need to understand the full architecture of the problem, because rumination, the repetitive mental processing of negative experience, is not simply a symptom of poor psychological health. It is a system with a function, and understanding the function changes how you engage with it. Susan Nolen-Hoeksema, a psychologist at Yale University, whose decades of research on rumination established it as one of the most powerful predictors of depression and anxiety in human adults, defined it as repetitive, passive focus on negative feelings and their possible causes and consequences. The key words are passive and repetitive. Passive. Rumination is not active problem solving, it does not generate behavioral options, does not test potential solutions, does not build toward the kind of resolution that would end the processing. It is the cognitive equivalent of spinning in place. The same content cycles through awareness, generating the same emotional response each time without approaching anything that would change the situation or complete the processing. Repetitive. The same material returns again and again without reaching resolution. This repetition is not random. It is a signature of the Zeigarnik Effect operating on emotional content, the mind returning to the open loop in search of the closure that has not yet been found. Nolen-Hoeksema's research found that people who ruminate extensively are 3 times more likely to develop clinical depression than people who do not. They make worse decisions during difficult periods, their interpersonal relationships show more conflict and less satisfaction, and they experience the duration of negative emotional states as significantly longer, not because their external situations are worse, but because the ruminative processing prevents the natural decay of emotional arousal that occurs when distressing content is allowed to process and complete. But here is the finding that complicates the simple instruction to stop ruminating. Research by Paul Watkins at the University of Exeter made an important distinction between 2 forms of mental processing that look similar from the outside but produce opposite outcomes. Ruminative processing, the passive, repetitive, analysis without resolution form, produces sustained negative affect and functional impairment. It keeps the threat signal active, keeps the stress hormones elevated, and prevents the natural completion of the emotional processing. Reflective processing, the active, directed, meaning-seeking form, produces insight, learning, and eventually the cognitive closure that allows emotional processing to complete. Reflection asks, what happened? What does it mean? What can be learned? How does this fit into a larger understanding of my life? And crucially, it moves. It does not circle. It proceeds from description through understanding toward integration. The difference is not in the content being processed. The difference is in the mode of processing. And what the research shows is that most people who think they are reflecting on a difficult experience are actually ruminating. They are engaging with the content passionately and at length, but they are not moving toward resolution. They are circling the same territory, feeling the same feelings, arriving at no new understanding, and calling this process working through it. Genuine reflection is rare because it requires tolerating the discomfort of genuinely not knowing, of being in the uncertain space between having experienced something and having understood it, long enough for genuine insight to arrive. Rumination is the way the mind avoids this uncertainty by staying busy with the familiar emotional content rather than sitting with the genuinely unfamiliar question of what the experience means. And the techniques that the research has developed to shift processing from ruminative to reflective are specific, teachable, and documented to produce measurable change. We are now ready to examine them directly. Ooh. Here is the insight that changes everything. And I want to say it plainly without softening because it is the kind of thing that is easy to hear and genuinely difficult to absorb. The Goldfish psychological practice is not about forgetting. It is not about suppressing. It is not about pretending that difficult things did not happen, or deciding not to care about them, or manufacturing a cheerful relationship with your own pain. All of those approaches fail, and they fail for the specific neurological and cognitive reasons we have been examining. The Goldfish practice is about completion, about moving the processing of a difficult experience from the open loop to the closed file, about giving the cognitive and emotional system the resolution signal it has been searching for, not by covering the experience over, but by moving through it in the specific way that delivers what it needs. And what does the experience need? It needs meaning. It needs integration into a coherent narrative. It needs the kind of deliberate, directed cognitive engagement that generates genuine insight rather than circling emotional activation. It needs, in many cases, to be observed from a position slightly outside the full immersion of the emotional experience, from the distance at which it is visible as an event rather than experienced as an ongoing state. This last point comes from research by Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan, whose work on self-distancing is among the most directly applicable in the entire psychology of emotional processing. Kross and his colleagues conducted a series of studies examining how the perspective from which a person processes a difficult experience, whether from the fully immersed first-person view or from a slightly distanced observer's position, affects the quality of the processing and its outcomes. The findings were specific and replicable. People who reflected on difficult experiences from the first-person immersed position, reliving the experience through their own eyes, using eye language, fully re-entering the emotional state, showed more ruminative processing, less insight generation, and more sustained negative affect. People who reflected on the same experiences from a slightly distanced position, imagining themselves as an observer watching the events unfold, using their own name or third-person language, showed less emotional reactivity, more analytical perspective, more genuine insight, and more adaptive meaning-making. The cognitive move is small, the effect is large. The shift from why am I still feeling this to your name, Lori, why are you still feeling this, is not just a linguistic game. Why are you... Neuroimaging studies conducted by Kross and colleagues found that self-distancing produced measurably different patterns of neural activation, specifically reduced activity in the regions associated with emotional self-referential processing and increased activity in regions associated with reappraisal and meaning-making. You are not stepping away from the experience when you self-distance. You are stepping into a position from which you can finally see it clearly enough to understand it. The full emotional immersion, the state that feels like you are taking the experience seriously because you are feeling it so intensely, is actually the state that prevents the genuine understanding that would complete the processing. Distance is not avoidance. Distance is the condition of genuine comprehension. And the completion, the genuine cognitive and emotional processing that delivers the resolution signal, closes the open loop, and files the experience as history rather than ongoing threat, is what the Goldfish is actually doing. Not forgetting, not suppressing, moving through, arriving at understanding, integrating, releasing, not because the experience did not matter, but because the processing is done. The Goldfish is not an amnesiac. The Goldfish is a complete processor, and the difference between those two things is everything. Let's get concrete, because the insight is valuable, but the mechanism needs to translate into specific, usable practice. The research has produced 5 approaches that consistently produce the kind of processing completion that delivers genuine psychological release. These are not motivational suggestions. They are interventions with replication records, neurological explanations, and measurable outcomes. The first is expressive writing, specifically the Pennebaker protocol. James Pennebaker, a psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin, spent 3 decades developing and testing what has become one of the most replicated interventions in clinical psychology, his basic finding. Writing about difficult experiences for 15 to 20 minutes, over 3 to 4 consecutive days, with specific instructions to move from description of events through emotional acknowledgement toward meaning and interpretation, produces measurable improvements in psychological and physical health. The studies found reduced intrusive thoughts about the processed experience, improved immune function, measured by lymphocyte proliferation and antibody response, lower healthcare utilization in the months following the writing intervention, reduced physiological stress response when the processed experience was recalled, and lasting improvements in psychological well-being that were not found in control groups writing about emotionally neutral topics. The critical element is the movement toward meaning. The instruction is not to vent, not to narrate the events and feelings in emotionally intense terms, which can produce the rumination-like reactivation of the experience without moving toward resolution. The instruction is to move from what happened and how it felt, through what it means, what I can understand from it, how it fits into my larger life. That movement, from description to meaning, is the mechanism that converts the expressive writing from emotional venting into genuine processing completion. The practical version: find a private place, set a timer for 15 to 20 minutes, and write without concern for grammar or audience. Begin with what happened and how it felt. Move as you write toward what it means. What did you learn? How does this fit into a larger understanding? What does this experience, when seen clearly, reveal about something important? You're not trying to produce a positive reframe or a cheerful narrative. You're trying to find the genuine meaning in the experience that the ruminative loop has been searching for. 3 or 4 sessions of this, and the research says the intrusive thought frequency drops measurably. The open loop begins to close. The second technique is self-distancing reappraisal. Cross's research established a simple and powerful intervention. When processing a difficult experience, deliberately shift from first-person to third-person language. Instead of "why am I still bothered by this?" Otobirisu ispominstupu, ask your own name. Why are you still bothered by this? When recalling a difficult event, deliberately imagine observing yourself in the scene rather than reliving it through your own eyes. This sounds trivial. The neuroimaging data says it is not. The linguistic and perspective shift produces measurable changes in neural activation within minutes of application. Less amygdala reactivity, more prefrontal engagement, less emotional flooding, more analytical processing. You can apply this in any moment when a difficult experience is surfacing. The ruminative thought arrives. Instead of immediately being inside it, step back. Use your own name. Why is name still thinking about this? What does name actually need here? What is name trying to work out? The question is the same as the first-person version. The position from which it is asked is different, and from that different position, the answer tends to be more insightful, and the processing tends to move toward completion. The third technique is temporal distancing. Research by Lauren Nordgren at Northwestern University and colleagues on what they call the 10-year question found that when people are asked to consider how they will feel about a current difficult experience in 10 years, their emotional distress about the current experience decreases measurably. Their decision-making quality improves, and their capacity to generate adaptive meaning from the experience increases. The mechanism is not that the future is more pleasant than the present. It is that the future perspective provides the kind of temporal distance that makes the current experience appropriately sized. The criticism that feels devastating today, the failure that feels defining this week, the social embarrassment that feels mortifying this month, viewed from the vantage of a future self who has lived through and passed the experience, almost universally reveal themselves to be smaller than they currently feel. The practical version: when caught in the grip of a difficult experience, pause and genuinely ask yourself, how will I feel about this in 10 years? What will the person I am in a decade think about how much energy I spent on this? This is not dismissal. It is perspective calibration. It is the deliberate adoption of the temporal distance that the future will provide automatically. Accessed now, when it is most useful. The fourth technique is self-compassion practice, based on the research of Kristin Neff. Kristin Neff, a psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin, has spent over 2 decades developing and testing a framework for self-compassion that has produced one of the most robust finding clusters in the psychology of emotional well-being. Self-compassion in Neff's framework has 3 components: mindful awareness of the difficult experience without over-identification or suppression, a sense of common humanity, the recognition that suffering and difficulty are universal features of human experience, not unique signs of personal inadequacy, and self-kindness, treating one's own suffering with the same warmth and understanding one would extend to a person one cares about. The research on self-compassion's effect on ruminative processing is specific and significant. Self-compassionate people show significantly lower rates of ruminative processing following setbacks and failures. They recover more quickly from difficult experiences. They are more willing to acknowledge their own mistakes without being overwhelmed by them, which means they can extract the genuine learning from the experience rather than either denying the experience or being consumed by the shame it generates. The mechanism. Self-criticism adds a second layer of threat activation on top of the first. When something difficult happens and the internal response is, "What is wrong with me? I should have known better. This is another example of my inadequacy," the brain processes the self-criticism as a second threat. The stress response to the original event is amplified by the additional threat of the self-evaluative attack. And this amplification extends the distress, increases the ruminative processing, and significantly delays the natural completion of the emotional response. Self-compassion removes that second layer. It does not remove the first. You are not pretending the difficult experience did not happen or that it did not matter. You are declining to add an additional source of threat on top of the one already present. And with that second layer removed, the natural processing of the original experience can proceed without the amplification that self-criticism generates. The practical version. When a difficult experience produces the familiar self-critical internal voice, pause and ask, "What would I say to someone I care about who was going through exactly this?" Then say that to yourself, not as a performance, not as a trick, but as a genuine cognitive practice. The deliberate application of the same standard of understanding to your own experience that you would apply to someone else's. The fifth technique is behavioral completion, addressing the specific unresolved element. The Zeigarnik Effect operates most powerfully on open loops that have a specific, identifiable unresolved element, a conversation not yet had, an acknowledgement not yet offered or received, an apology not yet given, a decision not yet made, a clear statement of closure not yet spoken. For experiences where a specific action is available that would provide genuine resolution, the most direct path to psychological release is the completion of that action. The difficult conversation, had with care and honesty, the apology, offered without qualification, the decision made clearly and committed to rather than held in perpetual provisional suspension, the explicit closure stated out loud or in writing, that signals to the cognitive system. This chapter is finished. Research on conflict resolution and interpersonal processing consistently finds that experiences involving other people are most efficiently processed when the interpersonal dimension is addressed, not only internally, but in the relationship itself. This does not mean that every difficult experience requires a difficult conversation. Sometimes the other person is unavailable, or the relationship has ended, or the conversation would cause more harm than the processing benefit it provides. In these cases, the internal work, the writing, the self-distancing, the meaning-making is the primary path. But when the specific unresolved element is an interpersonal one, and the conversation is genuinely available, the most direct route to closing the loop is often the most direct route, having the conversation. 5 techniques, 5 different points of entry into the processing that delivers genuine release. And the skill is not in applying all 5 at once, but in identifying which type of holding on you are dealing with and which technique most directly addresses its specific mechanism. Before we continue, I need to address the most common misreading of the goldfish metaphor. Because if it is misread, it becomes actively harmful rather than genuinely useful. The goldfish approach is not amnesia. It is not the elimination of memory or the erasure of what happened. And this is not just a philosophical caveat. It is a substantive point about what genuine psychological health actually looks like, supported by research that the simple "let it go" framing consistently ignores. Research on resilience, the capacity to recover effectively from adversity, conducted by Ann Maston at the University of Minnesota, whose work has been among the most influential in the field, found something that challenges the popular conception of the resilient person as someone who is minimally affected by difficulty. Maston found that resilient people are not people who feel difficulties less intensely. They are people who process them more completely. They feel the setback fully. They extract its information. They allow the distress to run its natural course rather than suppressing or avoiding it. And then, because the processing has been genuinely completed, they release it, not because they are tough and unfeeling, because they are thorough. Research by Sarah Seary and colleagues at the University of Buffalo found something even more counterintuitive. People with some history of adversity, who had faced difficult experiences and genuinely worked through them, showed significantly better psychological and physical health outcomes in response to subsequent difficulty than either people with no adversity history or people with overwhelming adversity history. The people with some processed adversity were more resilient not despite their history, but in part because of it. The goldfish does not forget in the sense of having no history. The goldfish has processed its history. And a processed history is different from a suppressed history, a forgotten history, or a ruminatively circled history in a specific and important way. It is available as wisdom without being active as distress. The experience that has been completed, that has been moved through, understood, integrated into the personal narrative as something that happened and taught something, is still there. It can be recalled. Its lessons are accessible. Its emotional significance is acknowledged, but it is not flagged as an ongoing threat. It is not generating the continuous low-level stress response that unprocessed experiences generate. It is not coloring the present moment with the residue of a past that is over. The goldfish move is not about having no memory. It is about having memory in the right relationship to your present experience. The past is informative and accessible, but it is not present. You are in today's water, not yesterday's. And the conditions that make this kind of thorough processing most possible, the environmental and relational factors that support genuine completion, are documented in the research with enough specificity to be worth examining in detail. There is a dimension of psychological processing that purely cognitive approaches to resilience and release consistently underweight, and it is, in some ways, the most important dimension for understanding why some people can complete difficult experiences alone, while others find that no amount of individual cognitive work is sufficient. That dimension is relational. Research by James Cohen at the University of Virginia on what he calls social baseline theory established something that is both scientifically specific and personally significant. The human nervous system is not designed to operate as an independent, isolated unit. It is calibrated to function within close social proximity. The stress and threat systems of the brain operate at lower baseline activation levels when a trusted person is present. The same objective threat produces measurably different physiological responses, different cortisol release patterns, different amygdala reactivity, different heart rate and blood pressure responses, depending on whether the person is alone, with a stranger, or with a trusted person. Cohen's research found, in one striking set of experiments, that people facing a mild threat while holding the hand of a trusted person showed reduced activation in the threat processing regions of the brain compared to the same threat faced alone or while holding the hand of a stranger. The trusted presence was neurologically registered as threat reducing even in objective situations where the other person could do nothing to influence the actual threat. What this means for psychological release is specific. The processing of significant emotional material is more efficient, more complete, and more likely to produce genuine release when it happens in a relational context of genuine trust and safety. Not because talking about things is inherently therapeutic, it is not, as we established in the discussion of venting and rumination, but because the nervous system's capacity for the kind of open, directed, meaning-seeking processing that produces completion is enhanced by the presence of someone whose presence signals safety at the neurological level. This is the documented psychological basis for why the most effective therapeutic modalities are relational. Why confession, in both religious and secular contexts, has a documented psychological function independent of its content. Why the experience of being genuinely heard by another person, not simply listened to but genuinely received without judgment, with real engagement and care, produces a different quality of processing than the same reflection done in isolation. The practical implication is not that you cannot process difficult experiences alone. You can, and the techniques we have discussed are effective in solitary practice. The implication is that if you find that solo practice is not producing the completion you are working toward, if the writing and the self-distancing and the temporal perspective are helping but not completing, the missing ingredient may be relational. The specific experience of bringing the difficult material into connection with another person whose presence is genuinely safe. And what genuinely safe means is specific. Not someone who will tell you what you want to hear, not someone who will minimize the difficulty to make you feel better, not someone whose response to your pain is to manage their own discomfort about your pain, someone who can receive what you bring without flinching, without rushing to resolution, without making the experience about something other than what it actually is. Someone in whose presence the defensive systems that usually prevent genuine self-disclosure can relax enough for the actual material to surface and process. The goldfish, in the complete picture, is not alone in the bowl. And the quality of the water, the relational environment, matters enormously for how completely the processing can proceed. There is a caveat that genuine honesty requires me to address directly. Because the prescription to release and let go, however evidence-based when applied appropriately, can become harmful when applied universally and without discernment. Research on grief, loss, and the continuing bonds that people maintain with significant others after loss challenges the dominant cultural narrative about the necessity of moving on. George Bonanno at Columbia University, whose longitudinal research on bereavement is among the most cited in the field, established that the trajectory of grief is considerably more varied than the stage model frameworks of earlier decades suggested. Bonanno found multiple distinct trajectories: resilient, recovered, chronic, and delayed, and that the resilient trajectory, involving minimal sustained functional disruption, was significantly more common than clinical models had assumed. But Bonanno's colleague, Camille Wortman at Stony Brook University, added the crucial complication. For a meaningful proportion of bereaved individuals, the cultural expectation that they should move on, let go, and achieve closure was itself a source of additional suffering. Wortman's research found that people who maintained ongoing internal relationships with deceased loved ones, who continued to speak to them, include them in their thinking, and feel their presence as a meaningful part of current life, did not show worse psychological outcomes than people who achieved more complete detachment. In many cases, the continuing bond was associated with better outcomes, more sustained meaning, more integrated identity, more stable well-being over time. The psychological literature now broadly recognizes that continuing bonds, the maintenance of internal symbolic relationships with significant others after loss, is a healthy and adaptive response for many people, not the pathological failure to complete grief that earlier frameworks classified it as. What this means for the goldfish psychology is important. The goal is not universal release of all held experience. The goal is the specific release of experiences that are being held in a ruminative, distress-generating, life-constricting way that are consuming present tense attention and energy in service of processing that is not completing. Experiences that deserve to be held, losses that merit ongoing relationship, formative difficulties that have earned their place in the identity narrative, relationships that continue to have genuine significance even after their external form has ended. These should be held with intention, with care, with the kind of conscious relationship to their presence in your life that honors their actual importance. The distinction the research draws is between experience that is held in ruminative distress, circling without completing, generating ongoing threat activation, preventing full engagement with present life, and experience that is held as genuine continuing relationship, as meaningful history, as the respected presence of what was lost or what shaped you. The first is what the goldfish practice addresses. The second is something different, and something that deserves not release but integration. Knowing the difference, in your own experience, with your specific material, is the most important piece of self-knowledge this research can offer you. Let's step back and take the long view. Because we have been examining mechanisms and techniques, and it is worth understanding what the accumulated effect of this practice looks like across a life. What the research says happens to people who develop genuine processing capacity, who learn to move through experiences rather than around them, who develop the goldfish quality of being genuinely present in today's water rather than still swimming in yesterday's. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, the longest-running longitudinal study of adult well-being in existence, following cohorts of individuals across more than 80 years, has produced a body of findings that converges on a conclusion that is both simple and profound. Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz, who published the most recent comprehensive synthesis of the Harvard data in 2023, describe the central finding in terms that are directly relevant to everything we have been discussing. The people who report the highest well-being in later life, who rate their lives as most meaningful, who maintain the best cognitive and physical health, who express the greatest satisfaction with who they have become, are not the people with the most impressive external achievements. They are not the people who avoided the most difficulty. They are the people who developed, over the course of their lives, the capacity for genuine relational connection, for being truly known by and truly knowing a small number of other people, in a way that sustained them through difficulty, contributed to their growth, and constituted the central source of meaning in their experience. And the capacity for genuine relational connection, the research consistently shows, is directly related to the capacity for genuine psychological processing. The person who is carrying significant unprocessed negative experience is, in specific and measurable ways, less available for genuine present tense connection. The unprocessed material filters perception, colors interpretation, activates defensive systems that reduce openness, and produces the specific kind of relational distance that makes true intimacy difficult, even when the person desires it genuinely. Every experience that is completed, every open loop that is closed, every ruminative cycle that is transformed into genuine reflective processing, every identity-incorporated difficulty that is integrated into a narrative of meaning rather than a narrative of wound, frees up cognitive and emotional resources for the present, not in a mystical sense, in a literal, neurologically measurable sense. The threat systems that were maintaining the unprocessed experience in elevated accessibility are no longer consuming resources. The attentional capacity that was diverted to circling the unresolved material is available for engagement with what is actually here. Research by Matthew Killingsworth at Harvard, using experience sampling methodology to assess the moment-to-moment relationship between mind wandering and well-being, found that people's minds are wandering off the current activity and into mental time travel, either backward to the past or forward to the future, approximately 47% of waking time. And mind wandering, across every activity category studied, was associated with lower happiness than mind-present states. The wandering itself was not the primary problem. The negative content of the wandering and the ruminative return to past difficulties, the anxious anticipation of future ones, was what most reliably predicted lower happiness in the moment. The goldfish life in this larger context is not a life without history. It is a life in which the history has been processed thoroughly enough that the present is genuinely available, where the mind wanders when it wanders but returns, where the difficult experiences have been understood and integrated, not forgotten, but filed as complete rather than flagged as ongoing, where the water you are swimming in is today's, with all the actual content of today, its genuine challenges, its actual relationships, its real opportunities for connection and meaning, rather than the accumulated residue of every previous body of water. This is not a fantasy state. The research documents people who approximate it. Not perfectly. No one processes every experience completely, and the imperfect processing of difficult material is a normal feature of a normal human life. But people who have developed the habit of completing their experiences rather than carrying them indefinitely, who have learned to recognize the difference between processing and ruminating, who have built the relational context that supports genuine processing, and who have practiced the specific techniques that move processing from circling to completion, these people show up in the longitudinal data with measurably better outcomes across every domain the research has examined. The goldfish is not a metaphor for forgetting, it is a metaphor for full presence, for the capacity to be entirely here, entirely in this water with this person at this moment, attending to what is actually in front of you. Because everything that has already happened has been completed, not denied, not suppressed, not forced into cheerful reinterpretation, completed, understood, integrated, released into history. That is the practice, that is what the research supports. And that, in the most precise and the most generous sense, is what it means to be a goldfish. Here is what I want to leave with you. Think of one experience, it can be small or significant, recent or old, that your mind returns to regularly. Something that surfaces with more emotional charge than the elapsed time seems to justify. Something that, when you examine it honestly, has the quality of an open loop. A feeling of something unresolved, something the cognitive system is still searching for. Now ask yourself, what does this experience still need from me? Not how do I stop feeling this? That question points towards suppression, which you now know does not work. But what is the specific processing that this experience is waiting for? Is it meaning that has not yet been found? A narrative that has not been completed? A conversation that has not been had? A self-compassionate acknowledgement that has not been offered? A perspective, temporal, distanced, observed rather than immersed, that has not yet been adopted? You do not need to complete the entire processing in the next 5 minutes. You do not need to resolve everything at once. You need to take one genuine step in the direction of completion. Open the document. Write the first few sentences. Ask the question from your own name. Try the 10-year view. Extend to yourself the first small gesture of the kindness you would offer to someone you care about. The open loop does not close all at once. It closes through the accumulated evidence that you are genuinely moving through the material rather than around it. And each small genuine step toward completion is a piece of that evidence. The goldfish is not the animal that forgets instantly. The goldfish is the animal that moves. That keeps swimming through the experience rather than endlessly around it, until the water on the other side is genuinely new. If the kind of conversation we have been having today, specific, grounded in real research, honest about complexity and genuinely applicable to whatever you are carrying, is the kind you want more of, this channel is built exactly for that. Every video is the same commitment. The science of how human beings actually work, without the oversimplification and without the platitudes. See you in the next one.